Great, yeah, thanks for the warm welcome. Thanks for coming. Excited to talk to you all and see what you think about what I have to say. Um, so, just get right into it. Um, so the point of departure for what I will talk about today is South Sudan's 2016 accession to what's called the East African Community, an ever-expanding regional political and economic union, including Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, and now most recently, DRC. My attention to this event emerges from a concept that I call, quote, actually existing Pan-Africanism. I started working out this idea in a 2021 article that I published in Transforming Anthropology called On Pan-Africanism and Secession. My goal in that piece was to be in dialogue with South Sudanese political thinkers in the 1960s as they navigated the question of self-determination as participants in the broader Pan-African imaginary, in which the sanctity of the borders of decolonization have tended to render secession itself and the desire for it as a uniquely disruptive force in the ongoing struggle to achieve the promise of political independence. Nevertheless, secession continues, and this is a map of all the, if all the current ones were successful. Secession continues to be an object of desire for many, as do the underlying conditions of inequality and marginalization that give rise to it. As such, I deployed actually existing Pan-Africanism as a method to appraise the substantive projects of unity and disunity that continue to shape contemporary politics on the continent. Moreover, it has enabled me to think critically about the narratives of domination and autonomy in which both the protagonist and the antagonist are global South actors. The new state of South Sudan is particularly generative to think with because it sits at a junction between accession and secession. On the one hand, it has formalized a new border with Sudan and redefined its geopolitical subjectivity, no longer non-consensually linked to the so-called Arab and Muslim world. On the other, it has eased the flow of people, goods, and capital southward to Uganda, Kenya, and to the English-speaking and Christian domain of East Africa. The flexibility and intimacy that this moment of geographic redefinition conjured has led me to think about concepts of world making. I'm thinking particularly of Adom Getachu's recent book in 2019. And I've been led to think about concepts like world making and analogous ideological commitments to a future alternative to that which the current moment appears to lead. And I've been led to think about how these seem to frequently fall within the purview of nostalgia, unrealized past visions, rather than an ethnography which confronts an unfolding present. I follow, for example, Kamari Clark's recent study of the International Criminal Court and the concomitant Pan-African rhetoric of critique as a guide with which one can continually appraise liberatory visions and the symbolically dense figure of the anti-colonial freedom fighter, particularly as they become inflected with the practice and lexicon of governance. What I'm getting at here is that the decision makers and leadership of organizations like the EAC and related institutions understand themselves as operating within the ideological legacy of Pan-Africanism, figuring out how to make real the vision ascribed to the pantheon of past freedom fighters. Therefore, one of my goals is to offer a contribution to push a North American-based anti-colonial imagination forward in the grieving process so that we might begin where the heroes left us rather than relitigate their struggle and collectively process how the horizons of the past are coming to life in the present and appraise both their grandeur and weakness, to borrow from Fanon. If actually existing Pan-Africanism helps me frame the broader approach I'm articulating, I use the concept of regioncraft to make sense of South Sudan's accession to the EAC, the historical imaginations on which it depended, and the aspirations it sought to bring into being. I use regioncraft as both a method and an analytic through which region becomes intelligible as a product of institutions and compelling as a site of futurity, imaginative ethnic belonging, and the messy reconciliation of asymmetries of power within the global South. Here I'm drawing on Hannah Appel's framing of the national economy, framing of how to do an ethnography of the national economy. Regioncraft captures the experiences and ideas of my past and present ethnographic interlocutors about their border-crossing attachments and political perspectives, as well as the ongoing supranational connections that appear as self-conscious institutions, projects, and personal emotional attachments to transborder geographies. Accession to the EAC becomes an object of anthropological analysis for me, as I am guided by how the anthropology of policy, a subgenre carved out by Chris Shore and Susan Wright, has asked, among many questions, what models of future society and normative ideals have been embedded in institutions and policy decisions. I'm also in conversation with anthropologists who have paid ethnographic attention to the form and function of region as both a cultural product of institution building, as with Chris Shore's work on the EU, and as a site of historical imagination and deeply rooted emotions about belonging and alienation, as with Naoura Ben-Yehuda's work on the Mediterranean. I'm also in conversation with work that has charted pathways to think about when processes of regional integration fail to produce harmony and asymmetries of power become intensified by the technocratic plans to rectify them, as with Elif Babel's work on the human rights rhetoric, on human rights rhetoric and training surrounding Turkey's process of accession to the EU. Continental scholars, like on the book cover that I've listed here, have highlighted this significance of East Africa as a powerful keyword, as they have recently taken up the question of what they call East Africanness. For them, East Africanness, as well as East Africanization, refer to ideas about identity, attachment, and belonging that link member state citizens both to their places of national origin, as well as to the multinational geographic area of the EAC member states. I fold their conceptualization of East Africanness into Regioncraft to help make sense of accession to the EAC as one significant driver in building the cultural politics of East Africa, as it embeds a transborder cultural imagination with technocratic expertise committed to harmonizing regional governance. With this in mind, I think about region not only as an ethnogeographic signifier, but also as constitutive of structures of feeling and standardizing forms. East Africa has become a keyword through which important social, historical, and cultural processes come to cast an imaginative popular unity on a heterogeneous ethnographic space, ethnogeographic space. This perspective enables one to ask what work an institutionalized idea of East Africa accomplishes in practice. I argue that it produces a liberal ideal of Pan-African political cooperation, in which being East African comes to index a certain level of political maturity, which renders member states like South Sudan into a dysfunctional black sheep, the delinquent behavior of which required a roadmap to correction. My deployment of the black sheep emerges specifically from two aesthetic representations that I'll show in a few minutes of South Sudan's accession to the East African community that capture both the institutional and everyday sentiments that centered on this contentious process. The moment of South Sudan's accession was one in which idioms of backwardness and the failure to live up to normative ideals became elements of an intra-African discourse. In terms of concrete, the methodology of my broader project, I conducted 18, as Mark mentioned in the introduction, I conducted 18 months of fieldwork in Sudan, South Sudan, and Kenya, and at the EAC headquarters in Arusha, Tanzania. Many of my interviews were in Arabic, English, or a mixture of both. Aside from the interlocutors with highly visible public profiles, all the names that I'll mention will be pseudonyms. My time in South Sudan emphasized how limited my ethnographic sensitivity was by entering this regional domain equipped only with Arabic. So I studied Swahili to be sensitive to how elements of that language and the geographies associated with it became meaningful sites of regioncraft. My methodology also built on Yarimar Bonilla's 2015 endeavor to theorize with one's interlocutors. She draws on Michel Roth-Trouillot's 2003 compilation to make the case for why anthropology must not simply incorporate voices of our interlocutors, but engage with their arguments and analytical contributions in order to be in more holistic dialogue with our interlocutors. I also engaged the memoir of deceased and retired political leaders ethnographically to engage long-standing ideas about individual belonging and how they condition desire, longing, and futurity in the present. I draw the significance of the black sheep as a conceptual intervention from two images. This is the first one. That captured the ambivalence surrounding South Sudan's accession to the EAC. The first, which appeared in the East African regional newspaper, depicted South Sudan as a literal black sheep among its regional neighbors, presented as normally colored white sheep. The East African newspaper operates as the de facto media arm of the EAC and occupies another register of regioncraft that I am also happy to talk more about in Q&A. In this regional newspaper, which is available in print throughout the region in all of the EAC member states, anthropologist Joke Madut Joke wrote a 2020 opinion editorial titled, quote, "South Sudan needs an honest conversation about its future in the regional bloc." This piece appeared as a centerfold story in the print version of the newspaper. In it, he outlined the widely held criticism of the EAC and of South Sudan's decision to join as one made exclusively by ruling elites who failed to seek popular approval. His perspective paralleled what Chris Shore has observed of critiques of the EU as a, quote, elite-led technocratic affair, orchestrated primarily by a small group of key politicians and civil servants. In the article, Joke Madut Joke maintained that political elites brokered the decision without popular consultation and sought accession too hastily. Emotion, rather than the imperatives of reasoned politics or widespread consultations, he argued, was the basis of what he and many others insisted was a geopolitical mistake. Joke associated the choice to join the EAC with an arbitrariness and irrationality that were not acceptable qualities of professional diplomacy. What was at stake was nothing less than the future and the question of how South Sudan would orient itself towards that future, either as the regional black sheep or as the subject of the collective hopes of the South Sudan that should have been. The image captured the disappointment in how South Sudan had appeared on the multinational scene, unable to pay its membership fees to the EAC, to end its own internal wars, to afford to send its representatives to summits, or to harmonize its border and visa policies with other member states. What's more is that this representation recruited a racialized aesthetics of regioncraft in which blackness signified the irreconcilably different outlier, whose embodied inferiority is measurable and unmistakable and seemingly unchangeable. 5 white, I read as normal sheep, identified in the were identified in this version that appeared in the East African. They were identified by the flags around their necks of the 5 previous member states: Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. Standing at center stage, the position in the stage, of course, is the East African flag that might be not that you can see underneath the feet of the sheep. Standing at center stage, the position of the black sheep suggests that it has recently been welcomed in and is undergoing an evaluative process. As the normal sheep surround South Sudan, their downward glances suggest that the black sheep has failed to integrate and may represent an irreconcilable asymmetry within this community. The significantly smaller black sheep looks up sheepishly, with eyes that seem to express both the willingness to learn and an embarrassment linked to a failed performance of its burgeoning East Africanness. The Nairobi-based illustrator of this image, John, described to me that he wanted to capture how people were feeling at the time, distant and cautious as they waited for the new country to harmonize with them. This is an image from a South Sudanese blog, which describes itself as by and for South Sudanese nationals. It was drawn by a South Sudanese artist based in Uganda. The knowledge required to dissect the message here, including both the geopolitical relationships it describes and the multiple languages it deploys, require the method of regioncraft. This is an example of what I mean by theorizing with my interlocutors. What I call regioncraft refers to my endeavor to participate in the interpretive act, even of laughter at an image like this, along with my interlocutors throughout the region. The image depicts both the relationships between regional entities and the regional epistemology required to decipher it. Of the 4 figures, the 3 on the left represent the heads of state from left to right: Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. Their interests in South Sudan are represented in the speech bubbles above their heads. Each state has its own interests. Tanzania's in oil, Kenya's in the land of the new state itself, and Uganda's in the new nation's economy. The 4th figure to the far right, raising his hand in greeting, symbolizes South Sudan. He is clearly out of sync with in terms of his professional attire: no pants, no shoes, without a proper dress shirt, and carrying a plastic bag rather than a briefcase. His shabby dress signifies multiple processes of differentiation that include class difference, the adolescence of South Sudan's nationhood, and categories often deployed by my interlocutors throughout the region, such as having a rough bush or village mentality, in contrast to the smooth cosmopolitan professionalism of his new counterparts. The speech bubble above South Sudan's head contains multiple languages and ideas about language. The Arabic script gestures towards South Sudan's lingering attachment to the Arabic-speaking world, particularly through the dialect of Arabic spoken in its capital city. Yet, the language in the speech bubble is not Arabic. There are two languages: Luganda, the primary language of Uganda, and a register of Kiswahili, a language utilized in various ways in all three countries, and particularly by South Sudanese intellectual elites after completing graduate degrees and/or professional training in Nairobi. The first word is sebo, Luganda for sir. This term has entered the lexicon of South Sudanese Arabic and English, both through individual experiences in Uganda and through forging relationships with Ugandan nationals in Juba. Since the representation of South Sudan utters this word first as a greeting suggests that the South Sudanese character is prioritizing his relationship to Uganda and its president, Yoweri Museveni. This arguably indexes the mythology and rumor with regional proportions surrounding Museveni's supervisory relationship with South Sudanese political leadership, past and present. And I'm happy to talk further about that in Q&A also. The second line is Hakuna Matata, which is a crude Swahili phrase for no problem, popularized, of course, by Disney's The Lion King. But it's not good Swahili. In this case, there is irony in the aspirational utterance of Swahili that is meant to indicate familiarity and instead deepens the feelings of estrangement. It is as if the representation of South Sudan is trying and failing to perform a legible East Africanness that both falls flat and is articulated in a way that subtly misses the mark. As the character tries to speak in an intelligibly African way, with undeniably African languages, he remains bound by Arabic in the Arabic-speaking world. The utterance of Hakuna Matata positions South Sudan as a foreigner, as out of place due to his failed performance among his new regional big brothers. As he falls woefully short of his goal and the eyes of his counterparts look incredulously to the side, it seems the depiction of South Sudan has tried and failed to assuage the fears and anxieties of his new counterparts, who may have granted his entry, but nevertheless distrust his capacity to change. Taking a step back from the institution of the EAC itself, there have been two endeavors to institutionalize an East African community. The first iteration operated from 1967 to 1971, founded by the first heads of state of Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, depicted here, Obote, Kenyatta, and Nyerere. The organization was resurrected in 1999, termed by some as EAC-2, followed by the launch of a customs union in 2005 and a common market with zero internal tariffs in 2010. The EAC consists of multiple organs with executive, legislative, and judicial objectives. Its stepwise goals include a customs union, a common market, monetary union, and an eventual political federation. The EAC also has an explicit cultural mission, although unevenly implemented, expressed on multiple levels by the consent of member states to recognize Kiswahili as a lingua franca, by the flag and Kiswahili anthem of the community, and by hosting cultural and athletic events such as the annual Jama Fest, like some images from the most recent one, and then one in 2019 that I thought depicted some of the ambivalent ways that South Sudan had entered into this place, because they got both the shape of the country and the flag wrong at this event. And not only wrong, but it's the shape of Sudan, right? Not South Sudan. The organization narrates its institutional legacy through successive iterations of colonial administration from 2017, from 2019, from 1917 until 1967, that have managed the distribution of goods and services throughout the region. Each colonial administrative unit, from the customs union between colonial Kenya and Uganda in 1917 to the East African Common Services Organization in 1961. In the narrative of the EAC, all of these organizations are linked in a transformative sequential chain that has led to the present-day formation of the EAC. When one thinks about region and the production of ideas about region in this case, one is always already thinking about the administrative legacy of colonial cartography, even as contemporary large-scale ideas about political community become inflected with emancipatory horizons. Upon accession, state actors articulated the future of South Sudan as one that lay squarely within East Africa. In his opening remarks during the 2015 negotiations between the government of South Sudan and the EAC, Dr. Barnaba Mariel Benjamin, the former South Sudan Minister of Foreign Affairs, reflected on accession as a symbol of freedom from the longue durée of cultural oppression under successive regimes of domination. Throughout the last century, he says, throughout the last century, South Sudanese did not have the freedom to choose their own destiny, first as part of the British colonial system, and then as part of the Republic of Sudan. It is only since the proclamation of independence in July 2011 that South Sudan is free to make its regional and foreign policy. The naturalness, ethnic and cultural, of South Sudan's place in East Africa has been echoed by regional political leaders in multiple of their memoirs. The memoir of Kenyan General Lazaro Sumbewo, the biographical memoir of his role as special envoy in the IGAD-led peace process that led to the splitting of the country, along with the autobiographies of Joseph Lagu, one of the leaders of the first rebel movement in South Sudan, and Bonama Lual, who's also from the same generation as Joseph Lagu, kind of long-term political activist. During my fieldwork, state officials and political thinkers continually established the decision to join the EAC on the foundation of cultural continuity. While not wholly displacing their historical connection to Khartoum and Sudan broadly, joining the EAC was narrated as a moment of ethnocultural destiny, anchored by the gravitational pull of the multiple ethnic communities, Luo, Acholi, Kakwa, Turkana, and others, in South Sudan that crisscross the new nation's border with Uganda and Kenya. Specifically, the significance of Uganda appears explicitly in the memoir of Joseph Lagu, the military and political leader of the Anyanya rebels who fought the first civil war with the Sudanese government. In his memoir, he wrestled with the cartography in which southern Sudanese were contained after independence from Anglo-Egyptian condominium control in 1956. Lagu reflected on how this policy decision has reverberated through time and conjured misalignments between identity formation and governance. He says, why on earth should we have Khartoum as our capital? It is far away and less sophisticated than Kampala, and its people are so different from us. Kampala is much nearer, and the people are plain Africans just as we are. I curse the British for drawing the frontiers without consideration for ethnic boundaries. I wish my tribal land had been carved all within Uganda. Lagu's imaginative ethnic belonging spanned the border between South Sudan and northern Uganda. And in this moment, he envisioned a world after colonialism other than the one that appeared before him. He projected the question of territorial administration onto the scale of desiring home rather than political containment. Lagu narrated the solution to alienation as the conjunction of identity and space, where within the continent, one might nevertheless feel more or less African. Khartoum and Kampala represented two poles on a spectrum of available intimacy. What existed for Lagu and Kampala was unavailable in Khartoum. Bonama Lual is of the same generation of past South Sudanese politicians as Joseph Lagu, and has been deeply involved in politics in Sudan for much of his near century of life. Malual's memoir offers another account of the intimate position of Uganda for the leadership of the Anyanya rebels. In his memoir, he reflected while on a trip to Juba to lead the debate with the government in Khartoum over how to share the oil that the American multinational Chevron corporation had located in 1978. He says, while I was in Juba at this time, for less than 2 years, my young brothers used to use this opportunity to obtain weapons that later became instrumental in their joining the SPLA for the liberation of South Sudan. Juba was close to the border with Uganda. The brutal regime of Idi Amin had just been overthrown, and obtaining firearms was almost like buying a cup of tea if one had the means. I spend time with these memoirs in my broader project, reading them through Michelle Ann Stevens' work on performances of Black masculinity, with the goal of recuperating the consensual and relational components of their contributions as they become articulated through Christianity, the family, and ideas about the home. My goal is to recuperate some of these elements, these more sort of relational elements, from an idealized hyper-masculinity that I think is often attributed to these kinds of national and continental political leaders. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A also. Yet, however ethnically or imaginatively aligned South Sudan is with the East Africanness of the EAC, it fell short of the criteria for membership. While it fulfilled the criteria of the geographical proximity and interdependence, it was engaged in its own civil war at the time of accession and therefore at odds with a crucial criterion for membership in Article 3 of the founding treaty, which reads that all members must be in line with the quote, universally acceptable principles of good governance, democracy, the rule of law, observance of human rights, and social justice, which, of course, during the Civil War, these things aren't happening. The process of accession, therefore, elicited protracted discussion and the eventual formulation of a roadmap so the Republic of South Sudan could eventually meet EAC standards. Despite being engaged in its own active civil war, EAC officials and regional leaders seemed to see the economic benefit of broader regional integration. Nearly all imports and non-oil exports transit through the port of Mombasa on the coast of Kenya. Membership in the EAC, therefore, signified an opportunity to facilitate providing South Sudanese citizens with what they need to live. The roadmap is a report that was drawn up by an independent Kenyan consultant contracted by the EAC and financed by GIZ, the German Development Agency. It drew from the expertise of a team of independent contractors employed by the EAC to compile a report in order to identify the political and economic institutions in South Sudan that did not meet EAC standards. The objective of the roadmap was to align with the Republic of South Sudan, quote, closer to the milestones that the other partner states have attained. When I sat down with the primary author of the roadmap, he reflected on writing the report as an act of responsibility towards a nation of peers in need of guidance. South Sudan's ongoing war posed a direct conflict to the stipulations of the founding treaty. The roadmap's author claimed that the EAC Secretariat allowed South Sudan to accede because they did not want it to end up, quote, end up like Gaza or Somalia. These two places in particular in this instance, became powerful icons, and I think that their symbolic kind of meaning extends beyond this context. They're powerful icons that have come to represent not only the threat of political intransigence, but how the inability to meet the expectations of the global order renders certain places irredeemable, worthy only of occupation and reformation. Phase 1 of the roadmap included the designation of the Ministry of Trade and Industry as the ministry responsible for EAC affairs, and for South Sudanese officials to undertake intensive capacity building training to enable them to better implement the integration process, integration milestones. Phase 2 included plans for deeper forms of financial and legal harmonization, cooperation in military activities, as well as participation in cultural events like the Jama Fest. South Sudan's insufficient East Africanness was both an affront to the institutional expectations of the EAC and to the hyper-professionalized expectations that the EAC aspires to signify. It is this desire that represents the ideal of liberal Pan-African cooperation. Non-South Sudanese EAC policy thinkers in Arusha constructed an imaginative hierarchy within the organization to make sense of this exceptional case. The registrar of the East African Court of Justice discussed both the problem of the legal education of South Sudanese judges and the overall preparedness of their new South Sudanese counterparts for the pressures of a multinational organization. He described to me how the South Sudanese representatives felt out of place in the halls of the Arusha headquarters because they still have a, quote, Bush military attitude and they are not yet civil. This assertion is indexical of the expectations of knowledge and behavior concomitant with participation in an organization like the EAC. The obstacle of legal education compounded the alienation of South Sudanese representatives within this organ of the EAC. In the East African Legislative Assembly, 2 judges from each member state must be appointed. As many of the eligible lawyers from South Sudan had received their law degrees in Cairo or Khartoum in the Arabic language and in Islamic law, the registrar claimed that, quote, when we went to train civil servants, most of what we presented was like Greek to them. Adding language itself as a barrier, the uphill battle in the IALA, East African Legislative Assembly, seemed endless to the registrar, and as he lamented, quote, that they still need thousands of trainings. As I spoke with others in the IALA, the frustration and disappointment they shared congealed around speculation about how South Sudan was to move forward as a responsible community member. Perhaps recognizing the harsh critique the IALA registrar had levied against his new colleagues, he softened his claims by extending the generosity that, quote, they are forgetting integration matters because they are focused on stability. In Arusha, my questions about South Sudan's recent accession were often met with long sighs and averted eye contact as EAC thinkers searched for ways to articulate constructive criticism. During my conversations with the primary author of the roadmap, he seemed to search for how to express the disappointment in the failure of the Republic of South Sudan to meet institutional standards and his frustration with how much time and effort he had spent in formulating a roadmap that he feared may not be implemented. He insisted to me, as if speaking directly to a South Sudanese audience, quote, "You didn't join to beg." He seemed to think that the desire to maintain East Africanness should motivate a member state to reform itself from the status of the black sheep, which threatened both the integrity and reputation of the organization, as, quote, the EAC can't just afford to focus on South Sudan's problems. Their solution to reforming and assimilating an entity from begging to contributing was for it to develop and strengthen its own institutions that were nevertheless in harmony with the EAC. Membership itself provided an opportunity for that transformation. Jacob, one of the 9 EAC representatives from South Sudan, lived in Nairobi at the time that I met him. Many of his colleagues lived permanent or itinerant lives in and through the city. Being East African for Jacob indexed responsible global citizenship that the South Sudanese masses may not yet understand, and that it was thus his responsibility to communicate the benefits of this relationship to a broader South Sudanese populace. He was a conduit through which his countrymen might witness and come to desire the increasingly technological and hyper-modernist urban future towards which cities like Nairobi are oriented. The figure of the black sheep does not operate without contestation. This is an image from a South Sudanese artist, a political cartoonist, representing the kind of the ways that South Sudan has been trapped, right, by some of the EAC organs as East African counterparts take money from their pockets. The figure of the black sheep does not operate without contestation to the unequal relationship in which it is interpolated as subordinate, with little or no agency over the conditions under which it joined. My interlocutors in Juba, Khartoum, and Nairobi often reflected not only on their disenchantment with South Sudan's membership in the EAC, but broadly on a hierarchy of African regional unions, contrasting the EAC namely to ECOWAS, its West African counterpart. While EAC representatives like Jacob may be appealing to regional leadership for lessons in good governance, there is nevertheless profound debate about whether the EAC is an effective institution and whether membership benefits South Sudan. In Nairobi, Peter Niaba, another prominent South Sudanese politician, has remarked on South Sudan's accession, not simply for its own shortcomings, but because, quote, the EAC has no unified vision or project, but multiple disconnected directions towards which it marshals its political, cultural, and economic plans. In Khartoum, I sat outside of Comboni College, the alma mater of another interlocutor, Yidi, and many of my other interlocutors congregated outside of Comboni College, which I could explain in Q&A if necessary. When I asked him about South Sudan's accession, he replied, quote, "There is no economic gain for us in East Africa, as membership has only further entrenched dependence on neighboring countries to import basic commodities." For Peter Niaba, a longtime activist, politician, and first minister of higher education in independent South Sudan, regional organizations such as the EAC were ineffective due to their lack of military strength and clear vision. He contrasted them with ECOWAS as a regional organization that, for him, quote, when we sat down in Nairobi, meant, for him, quote, "They mean business and they have teeth." These are quotes from him, and represented that the ECOWAS included and represented West Africans who, quote, "unlike us, South Sudanese, are committed to their founding charter." Implicit in the comparison between the subject of West Africans and South Sudanese are two recognizable types of a supranational citizen. This was a moral and behavioral evaluation consonant with how South Sudanese representatives to the EAC made sense of the benefits of membership as a relationship of tutelage. The difference between these two imaginative types was a matter of time and training that South Sudan could only learn from its more experienced neighbors. The same qualities that Jacob in Nairobi understood as South Sudan's original and perhaps essential East African and SPLM in opposition, that's the major opposition party in South Sudan, and they have an office, headquartered office in Khartoum. One of their spokespeople derided the accession process as resulting from South Sudan, quote, yearning for a place to empower itself. In this instance, the accession process emphasized the extent to which South Sudan was adrift in a global order, in which supranational association provides solid ground for a place in the world. And there I'm drawing on James Ferguson's idea. Yet for this interlocutor, who I'm calling Gatwich, as well as for Jok Madut Jok earlier, this stance came with an overly emotional haste that led to the decision to join the AC without, as Gatwich described, fully understanding, this is another quote, the requirements, the financial in particular, for membership. What accession produced, therefore, was yet another form of alienation as South Sudan became estranged by its failure to harmonize. Region, in this context, is a protean formation, the cultural contents of which have been shaped by a particular political moment, certain conditions, historical experiences, and using Catherine Besseman's study of race and slavery in Somalia, in the memory of particular historical nightmares, and in the service of particular aspirations for the future. For anthropologists of contemporary Africa, this scale of community attends to the multiple nodes of attachment that are ever present for our interlocutors. The vocabulary of nationhood and the lingering attachment to anti-colonial nationalism leads away from multi-sided or multilingual research that confronts the nation-state as one parochial register among many through which people are already narrating their lives and desires for the future. A robust method that provides the tools to think through how region becomes both compelling and intelligible provides another escape route from the trap of methodological nationalism that I think masquerades as resolved even as it continues to haunt our vocabulary. There are both possibilities and limits immanent in the form and function of region. On the one hand, it can encompass ideas about self-determination and cultural freedom as a site of geopolitical refuge for a nation emerging from substantive and ideological war. On the other, regional forms of governance also come with their attendant forms of surveillance, militarism, and desires for stability, which enable multiple trans-border assemblages of police and military action. As such, the question of region moves the debate about the limits of political independence towards critical attention to one of its partial solutions. What I've shared today has been an attempt to appraise an alternative geopolitics of national community and ideas which expand beyond intransigent attachments to sovereignty that engender increasingly securitized borders. Regioncraft opens up the terrain to address the Pan-African present, its active relationship to the past, its asymmetries, and its goals. Thanks.
Okay, well, you've put a lot on the table for us all to think about, and I'm going to be very interested to see how the thoughts go. I'm going to take advantage of the privilege.
This was absolutely fascinating, and I can think of 100 directions we could ask questions in, and I look forward to conversing with you about it as we go forward. For the meantime, does our topic have anything to do with what I'm looking at on the map, namely land and water? Right. Water, as in the biggest river, longest river in the world. Water is a familiar word, but I love the word regioncraft, so I'm going to make up a word, landlockery.
Yeah, yeah.
Is this part of our topic?
Yeah, I think so. Or yeah, I think that the desire to be in the EAC, I think, facilitates the movement of goods from Mombasa. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that there is a very kind of real economic motivation to join an organization like that. And also, I think that even without the even without attention to water, right? The lack of infrastructure and manufacturing capacity, obviously in South Sudan, they have to import everything, just about, aside from I think there's a beer bottling company and maybe a water bottling company, but everything from clothes to tomatoes to mangoes to all the kind of things they can grow in South Sudan, they have to import from Uganda and Kenya. So this also is facilitated.
Preferably Tusker.
Tusker, right? That's the Tusker and White Bull, yeah. So yeah, I think that there's obviously that material, substantively material drive to why a decision like this would be made. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Say, I am sort of stunned by the whole question of identity in Africa and its many pieces, and the legacy of colonialism and the cartology of colonialism. But I also have found that the question of regionalization and the term you're using, regioncraft, is, to me, seems like a cascade of multiple things happening all at once. And you focused on the EAC. The curious thing is, when we think of Pan-Africanism, the African Union, of course, is the most encompassing of the organizations. But there might have been other alternatives too, I don't know. I'd like to ask you about how you see South Sudanese efforts at self-identity, and I'm not sure what the correct term is, but placeness, finding a place in the EAC, as opposed to the AU or some other organization that might have made sense.
Oh, yeah. Like other alternatives. Yeah.
Well, did they think about joining COMESA?
Yeah. There's also the International Conference for the Great Lakes region that I think they're also a party to. But I think that, so part of the kind of broader question is both that they have this contentious accession to the EAC, but they also, I think in the euphoria of 2011, they joined a number of regional organizations. So there was also EGAD, EAC, and the internet and the Great Lakes region. All these organizations also have you have to pay. You know, the member states have to pay a contribution. And so I think that when folks like Joker Joker or Peter Nyaba are kind of launching this critique around the decision, that they're like, well, how did anyone ask the question of how can we afford all of this? How can we afford all these membership fees? So I think the question of like whether there are alternatives, I guess the way I want to answer that is like, well, they essentially like joined everything.
They did it all.
Yeah, and then I think the other kind of more identity-laden question is this question of like observer status in the Arab League, because when they were part of Sudan, of course they were part of the Arab League, and now but because both Sudan and the machinations of the Arab League continue to be relevant for South Sudanese folks, this question of, you know, what should our status be in the Arab League became like it became you know, one of these multiple puzzle pieces around how do we sort of express our sort of geopolitical place in the world through our membership in these organizations. And so I don't know if I think that there is an alternative path, because I think that in the aftermath of partition, these organizations offered a kind of I think it offered a kind of like a kind of diplomatic hominess, feeling, you know, that we have somewhere that we can turn to after we've kind of gone through this like ongoing bad divorce with Sudan, right? And I think that gets expressed sometimes, like I mentioned in what I just said, is that I think sometimes has actual expressions in actual families, and I think in actual sort of forms of intimacy that are can extend, that can be expressed in, for example, people's families and the ages of their children. Essentially, you're able to sort of track where somebody was depending on what languages their children speak and where they were educated, right? So, you know, like the different generations of children, one generation might speak Arabic and have gone to school in Khartoum and Cairo, and the other one now speaks Swahili and they went to school in Nairobi and Kampala. And so I think that when families, you know, and those families are often the families of the diplomats themselves, right? And so I think that, I guess maybe one way to address that question is like, could they have not joined any organization at all, right? And
well, they could not have.
Yeah, I think that was kind of off the table. Yeah.
Yeah. I find it very interesting because my own experience is one in which functionality doesn't necessarily map onto identity or regionalization.
Right. Yeah.
They don't match properly.
Yeah.
Frequently. That's probably true in many things. I'm sure you could find that in, I don't know, the OAS, for instance. I have no idea. But anyway, let's keep going. Thank you very much. Dave.
Yeah. I had a question sort of related to your last point, Mark, which is why I'll start with that. Zach, thanks for a really great talk. I have a lot of questions, and I'll try to limit them here. My first question is, like, you talked about Regioncraft really as a political project, and I'm curious how it exists as a cultural project as well. Like, you spoke briefly about sort of language and other forms of belonging and these kind of dispersed family networks, but that doesn't need to go along with political integration. That can be an entirely separate sort of form of Regioncraft. So I'd be curious your thoughts on that. I'm also curious, you showed the image of South Sudan as a black sheep.
Yeah.
Does the DRC not come under that umbrella as well, or is that that integration seen differently as South Sudan? Yeah. And then I had one other question, but it's sort of oh yes. So my last question is, how is Regioncraft? You were mostly talking about people who were very involved in the liberation struggle or diplomats and things of that sort. How is Regioncraft either gendered, or does it fall along class lines, education lines? Perhaps even religious lines. Like, what sort of ways does that Regioncraft get expressed differently by different people?
Yeah, thanks.
You don't need to answer all of those questions.
It's a lot.
So Regioncraft is a cultural project. So I think I approach this a number of ways. One is that I think the EAC is, I think, at least relatively unique amongst organizations like it, because it has this cultural project that not only on the consent to support the instruction of Kiswahili in schools, however this happens or not, right? This is in the founding treaty, right? And then all of these kind of Commonwealth Games-esque events that are held variously around in the member states, that often are essentially like cultural shows, where there's got dances and art and this kind of stuff, and there's a kind of something that I'm sure people in this room are really familiar with, this kind of like Pan-African festival of cultures, right? But then I think there's also in addition to that, the way that culture can sort of be expressed like ethnically or in ideas about ethnic community, I think there's also the idea of for many of my interlocutors, an idea around like what East African general culture kind of means in opposition to like Sudanese culture, in the sense that there's a certain kind of that living in Nairobi, for example, comes with a kind of like life feels more atomized. There's obviously like there's no prohibition on alcohol. And there's like there's a kind of in Juba, the way that people will sort of talk about the influx of East African folks is like as if all of these like cultural patterns, like sort of a kind of more like individualized lifestyle where you go out to drink, right? This is a problem, right? In the sense that as much as there might be ire if you make any kind of insinuation that anything from Sudanese culture is like a holdover, right? If you say that the reason why they don't eat a lot of pork in South Sudan has anything to do with Islam, right? Of course not. We don't eat pork because the Dinka have traditionally not eaten pork, right? If nothing, there's so much sort of ire around that. But like nevertheless, some of the kind of everyday kind of elements of life of Khartoum, where folks will narrate it as like that you feel much more kind of like supported by the broad family unit, and even if you don't have a job, you won't have to worry about going hungry. But in Nairobi, if you don't have a job, you're going to starve, right? Because you're just living alone, right? So I say that to say that culture gets articulated in that way, and then on the class and religion and how it gets the region gets articulated in that way, and gender. So I on one level, I think it's kind of clearly the case that there's a kind of like masculine privilege around like being able to sort of bounce around the world like this, or bounce around the region in that way. But then I think because of what I just mentioned around families being segmented by like where they've been, right? You can have any member of the family, the children, the wives, the sort of understanding of the family can only really become coherent if as people will say, like, oh, our home is the whole Nile Valley, right? Because if you spend large amount of years in Uganda, another large amount of years in South Sudan, Egypt, and whatever. So the only way for us to sort of describe, where our family is from is to talk about all these different places, right? And that, in a way, I think, kind of starts to disaggregate the kind of hyper masculinity of, like, of like a kind of migrant man that isn't sort of tied down at all. And then I think there's also some religious elements too, but maybe I'll use that in other questions to talk about that. Yeah.
Professor Emeritus James McCann.
Thank you.
Love the title.
I have an extremely pedestrian question that relates to some of what Parker alluded to and you just mentioned now. Imagine that we're in one of several places in South Sudan, along the border, along the place. Something that connects the colonial period to modern material life in Africa is, if we're in South Sudan, what beer are we drinking?
Oh, yeah. Either
you look at the national identities of Give a Guy a Green was about green beer.
Yeah.
Tusker
and White Bull. Yeah.
Maloti versus Neta
Yeah.
versus Gog. All these different beers tell you something about identity.
Yeah.
Who do you relate to historically?
Definitely.
And now. So what beer are we drinking if we're sitting in Juba?
Yeah.
For a while? So.
Yeah. So that actually it isn't even a pedestrian question because so Tusker is a popular one. There's also a South Sudanese beer called White Bull that draws from the iconography of the kind of like familiar association of South Sudan as like cattle herding folks of the like Nuer and Dinka, right? So it's got the longhorn bull on it. But the Tusker one, I think was really fascinating, and this is something that I talk about elsewhere in my project, is almost every instance when I sat down with someone to drink and we were drinking Tusker, right, they would turn the label towards me and they would say that the label was actually an acronym that stood for all the East African countries: Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, Kenya, Rwanda, right? Yeah. Even though the name Tusker comes from the two like elephant hunting brothers from the UK that founded the brewing company that brews Tusker, right? Tusker was a reference to people hunting for ivory, right? But the name and the way that people would sort of feel attached to drinking Tusker in Juba, for example, would be another way where people would articulate sort of feeling like they belong in this broader geography, right? That even the beer like represents the connection between all these places.
It's both identity and it's also a projection of a choice.
Yeah.
Whether you say Budweiser tells you something about the class, social class.
Yeah.
And a whole series of things.
Yeah.
It's one window into how people deal with identity. Yeah. Particularly male.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah.
Medea, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to, but otherwise I can read your question here from Medea Thompson. You mentioned that the EAC helps itself to South Sudanese money. It helps itself in quotes. How does South Sudan generate income?
Exporting oil, I think, is really much the only thing that is the only like money producing. Like I think the majority of the GDP is kind of comes from the export of oil.
I just opened my mic. Hello, Mr. Mondesire. Zachary, there we are. Zachary, this is Madia. I posed the question because I've been hearing about, with all the fighting back and forth and the struggles there in Juba and the other places where I believe the oil wells are. I've wondered about this. How do they how does South Sudan generate income, and who's asking for it? As the black sheep. So, but yeah, you've started answering the question. That was all.
Oil is the main answer, but then that also gets folded into the question of region, because the oil has to get out of South Sudan in the sense that there's it's a landlocked place, so it either has to go and now it all goes through Port Sudan still, so all of the oil is being exported still through agreements. Like all the companies that existed only in Sudan before partition have just now been mirrored in South Sudan. But at different points, there's been, I think, probably largely like a kind of like empty threat, probably. That some of these kind of large projects, like right now, I think there's some kind of re-energized attention to the East African oil pipeline that I think is a project, at least that includes Uganda, right? So there's some level of like using these like potentially new ways of getting oil out of South Sudan through Mombasa that become ways to like renegotiate the agreements, the oil sharing agreements with Sudan. But as of yet, no secondary pipeline exists to get the oil out. So oil is how there's no GDP other than with oil, and the oil leads through Sudan.
Yeah, and it's a troubled sort of passage as well.
Yeah.
Have you? You mentioned Uganda, and not too long ago there was a presentation on the attempts to drill wells there in Uganda. Is there some? I mean, how would that work? You've got the neighboring countries. That's also pulled in? Is that all part of the confusion then, in terms of getting oil and getting oil out for delivery and in order to generate income? Is that what I'm understanding? Is that?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, I think when it comes to the question of oil, the East African kind of valence of the question of oil, I think, becomes a kind of like bargaining chip around South Sudan's relationship to Sudan to say that in the future we'll be able to export our oil through East African pathways and not through Sudan's pathways.
Okay.
They haven't happened yet.
Interesting. Pipelines may also contribute to identity.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take one more question on Zoom, and then we'll turn to Kimberly. So Ellen Master, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to. Otherwise, I can read your questions.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this really thought-provoking talk. So I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about the impact of so many violent conflicts in South Sudan and the neighboring countries on these deliberations, these various perceptions of each other, et cetera. And then I also wondered whether you had engaged conversations with stakeholders, because so much of the economies of these EAC countries, these member states, come from humanitarian and development assistance. And I wondered, have conversations with stakeholders influenced the conversations that you're studying?
So I don't really study violence, but I will say that one of the ways that region becomes relevant in this question of violence and ongoing violent events in and around South Sudan is that not only the most meaningful peace talks, but the peace talks that tend to have the most lasting effects are the ones that are managed by regional leadership, including the peace talks that led to the partition, but the peace talks that led to the end of the civil war in 2017. These are all like IGAD-led talks where there's a regional representative rather than a representative from the global north that comes and mediates. And I think that because violent conflicts are like so frequent and so frequently written about when it comes to South Sudan, and obviously so frequent in people's everyday lives, peace talks are also an element of everyday conversation around like which peace talks are the most effective, which envoys are the most effective. So this also the kind of like regionally led peace talks as the most effective ones are also becomes a kind of element of this expression of regional identity that the issues can only be kind of mediated or resolved by people who feel kind of close to the issue or somehow like identify with the issue. I'll also say that maybe the closest thing that I come to talking to stakeholders is probably the way that I when I engage this regional newspaper called the East African. They are folks who feel who also feel intimately connected to the EAC and intimately connected to the sort of underlying through their underlying funding stream connected to the EAC. But so much of their editorial decision making, I think, in the years that preceded the end of South Sudan's civil war, when I spoke with the editorial staff at the East African, they are engaged in a kind of conscious effort to what they described as like offering, publishing stories about South Sudan that wouldn't contribute to the kind of fatigue of hearing constantly about violence. So the editorial staff of East African, as they're trying to sort of like interpolate a regional community through their publishing of regional news, right, made certain explicit decisions to publish stories about, the kind of individual, for example, a couple years ago there was the first South Sudanese executive appointed to Kenya's Equity Bank. His last name was Addis Ababa, Dr. Addis Ababa. And there was this whole, I forget he had a longer first name, but there was a sort of a whole centerfold story about this person's, his sort of like his career trajectory and the ways that he sort of felt, kind of proud to represent South Sudan in this broader multinational institution. And this story was part of many that had come out as a kind of effort to like essentially stop talking about violence so much, because they were like, our audience is fatigued, and if we as the East African are kind of committed to inculcating, if we're committed to giving shape and form to this regional community, then everybody's going to have to continue to be invested, right? And if they can continue to hear stories of violence over and over, people are going to get fatigued by this. And so So I guess just to say again, there was a kind of like concerted effort to. I think they called them feel-good stories. And there was, and in my conversations with those folks at the newspaper, there was some frustration with the reporters. They sort of wanted to get at something that they felt was more kind of, real and from the grassroots. But nevertheless, the editorial staff are like thinking about, how do we keep everybody invested in this thing called East Africa, particularly as the newest member that we all sort of saw fight for self-determination, and we were all excited when it happened, and we were all sad when John Garang died, unexpectedly, 2005 helicopter crash, right? We in Kenya feel so connected to this. We also have responsibility to like represent this place in a way that the member states and their sort of popular communities will also come to feel as connected as we do at the newspaper.
Okay.
This. So I'm going to start with just an observation. The two different political cartoons that you put side by side, the black sheep and then the one that sort of played with linguistic registers, seem to me to be fellow travelers in two very dramatically different ways of conceptualizing the sameness and difference of South Sudan vis-a-vis the EAC.
Yeah.
And so that opened up the question for me, who says what in what context, in part because it seems like there are so many different strains of thinking about cultural sameness and difference that come from so many different locations, right? One that clearly seems to be colonial, as you mentioned, in origin, which is kind of, it sounds a lot like the EU, very focused on like bureaucratic efficiency, others that are focused on Arabness, others that are focused on Blackness, and trying to sort through when those become fellow travelers, for how long, and when they fall apart, and then who articulates what as the, to get back to this question about, does class matter, does gender matter, does religious positioning matter, like thinking about who articulates which of these in what context and what kinds of allies that generates, and then which kinds of other stories that alienates. And it just seems like this fascinating kaleidoscope where spending a little time sorting out some of these strains that are all mixed up in what you talked about, but that you don't exactly disentangle except to sort of gesture to various possible origins. And those two political cartoons really sort of scream for, like, what's the difference between the South Sudan being a black sheep and the South Sudan being too Arabic? And for whom would each of those tropes be mobilized as a way of doing the same work but in entirely different ways, and therefore alienating or uniting with various different kinds of... Anyway, I just thought that was a fascinating possibility of like resorting the material that you present. You know, obviously there's tons to do with what you presented, but like, you know, expanding out and letting us better understand the articulation of these discourses in relation to particular groups of people in your studies.
Right. I think that the kind of like the representation of South Sudan as sort of being too kind of still still wrapped up in the Arab world and in the Arabic language. In the context of these EAC bureaucrats who are interested in like appointing judges who are trained in civil law and speak English, like this, their inability to like their like lack of training in civil law and training in Islamic law, in that instance, like become entangled with their sort of like blackness, right? In the sense that they're sort of, they have this bush and village mentality, and that bush and village mentality comes like alongside this cartoon-based legal training, and I
was just thinking about Turkey's accession to the EU, right? So the EU makes all kinds of excuses that are bureaucratic excuses for something that also is at the same time a kind of cultural argument. And different people make different versions of that argument depending on how they imagine what the EU actually is. For me, I mean, obviously in the black sheep example, the blackness is really front and center. And the other one, the blackness is not front and center, right? Blackness does not seem to be what it's about, although bushness very well might be. And then how that intersects or doesn't intersect with, you know, other registers of objection would be, I mean, I think kind of interesting to sort of sort out, because it's not like one doesn't explain everything about the other in some ways, right?
I think I see them as like two complementary expressions of how South Sudan gets kind of articulated in this way. And I think that's an interesting kind of opening to think about what blackness actually like signifies in certain places, because I think that I think I also read the sort of the aspirational diplomat representation. I also read a certain kind of blackness there too, but the blackness isn't necessarily like signified by skin color, but signified by their kind of like unpreparedness and they're kind of dirty, and like there's like a level of disgust, I think, that's being depicted there. But I think what's interesting about that is that was drawn by a South Sudanese artist, right? Who is like I think offering a critique, just in the same way that Joke is offering a critique in East Africa in the newspaper of this of this kind of like rash geopolitical decision that is kind of based in this kind of cultural aspirational kind of thinking. But yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that.
Okay, Zach, you've opened up a lot of questions. I also think this mode of analysis, while it's focused on South Sudan and the EAC, could be applied in so many different places. And so that, to me, is really kind of an exciting window onto so many things about identity and culture and politics, not just in Africa, also in many other places. But let me just conclude by saying, Zach, Professor Mondesire, thank you so much. You are new here at Pardee. I didn't even realize it's actually only your second semester here at Pardee in Boston University, but you obviously are a member of our community, and we're delighted you were willing to join us. And
the UCLA brand is strong.
Okay. All right, everybody. See you soon.